welcome to the 23rd episode of the Head to Head podcast. I'm your host, Cam McKinney. In this edition of the podcast, I will be talking about the NBA and specifically how I think the Eastern Conference isn't that much worse than the Western Conference. For years and years, NBA fans have been living with this myth that the Western Conference is so much better than the Eastern Conference. And quite frankly, I'm just getting sick of it. The other day I thought about this, and I'm going to share my thoughts on it. Listen, this is the way I'm going to put it. The top of the West is clearly dominant, but it's only dominant this year and last year because of one team and one team only, the Golden State Warriors. Last year we had the Warriors and the Rockets dominating the West, 60-plus wins each. Powerhouse franchises. You knew the NBA title was going to be those two teams. This year, they have just the Warriors. Outside of the Warriors, there are just a bunch of teams with flaws, real flaws. And I want to discuss those teams. So that we have the Golden State Warriors. After that, I still believe we have the Houston Rockets. But what really do we have in the Houston Rockets? Not much. That's what. Then after that, you have Oklahoma City with Russell Westbrook and Paul George, but they're underachievers. You have the Portland Trailblazers, who I just flat out don't believe in. You have teams like the Pelicans, which again, Anthony Davis is great, but I don't believe in them as a team. Memphis is frauds. They're not real. There's nothing real there. The only real team I see in the West is the Golden State Warriors with the potential of the Rockets and the Thunder to be real. But the Spurs are not in the playoffs right now. The normal teams, the Mavericks are a 500 team. They're not that good. The top of the West is why so many people think the West is so much better than the East because they have the Warriors. And I know the Warriors are a powerhouse franchise, one of the best basketball teams I've ever seen. But that doesn't mean the conference itself is that much better overall than the East. It's just not the case. I've been watching basketball regularly since 2008. When the West really was the king of the NBA. They had 8 teams win 50 games, and Golden State missed the playoffs as a 48-win team with Baron Davis and Steven Jackson. And for a decade, we said, well, if that team was in the East, they'd be the number 1 seed. Or if that team were in the East, they'd be the 2 seed. Yes, there are years where it seems like the West has been the overall better conference. But now we're living a complete lie. They're not that much better. Let's look at the top of the East. You have, right now, the Raptors with Kawhi. Kawhi's a real MVP caliber player. You have the Celtics with Kyrie, Gordon Hayward, and those bunch. You have the Bucks, who are a surprise start, 3-point-wise. You have the Pacers with Victor Oladipo and Miles Turner. The East have some legit teams. That's without even mentioning the Philadelphia 76ers, who might be the best or the second best or the third best team in the entire conference. Those teams are legit. So maybe the overall top of the West is better, but the East goes deeper. The bottom of the West is complete and total trash, and I'm going to say that. I don't really know what the Nuggets are. The Kings are lame. I'm just being honest with you. I don't believe in any of those teams, but I do believe there are some real legit teams in the East. All those teams are legit and could make a conference finals in the East. And it's not because it's the East. I believe those teams are better and some of those teams would make the Western Conference Finals. Philadelphia would be the second best team in the West right now. The Celtics would be the second best team in the West right now. And of course, I believe the Raptors would be the second best team in the West right now. That's legit. The Bucks have the potential to be the second best team in the West. All of those teams are right now better than the Rockets, better than the Nuggets, better than the Oklahoma City Thunder, better than the Clippers. Who really believes in the Clippers and the start that they're on? My overall point is I do believe that the Eastern Conference isn't the little brother here to the West anymore. The West has this reputation of being like that, but those teams aren't that good. The free teams from the free teams from Texas and the West aren't as legit as they used to be. It used to be the Rockets, the Spurs, and the Mavericks were all 55-win powerhouses. They're not that anymore. They're not the same teams. The West is not your dad's conference anymore. It's not the conference I grew up watching. It's not that teams with the Phoenix Suns win 60-plus games. Yes, the bottom of the East is trash, but the bottom of the West, it's not as deep. It's not deep. The West might have the West is full of a team of. I'll say this: the West is full of teams that are just stagnant. They are where they are. They're not going to overachieve. They're not going to underachieve. They're just there. The East has more teams with the potential to be good. Their top is overall better. I'm not going to sit here and say that I believe the Eastern Conference is a better conference because there are a lot of bad teams in the East. There are teams like the Magic who are going nowhere. I don't really know where I am with the Wizards right now. I mean, they could be an argument for both sides right now. The West doesn't have a team as erratic as the Wizards, but the Wizards have the potential to be a really good team with John Wall and Bradley Beal, and they've been playing better lately. But my overall point is that this overall myth, that the West is just so much better. It's just not the case. It's not the case. I'll put it to you this way. If the Warriors weren't around, I would pick a team from the East to win the NBA Finals this year, whether it was Boston, Philly, or Toronto. Those three teams, I'm not going to put Milwaukee to win the NBA Finals because that's a huge jump. But some of those teams have been in the playoff battles before. Philadelphia last year, that really helps them. Boston, of course, went to the conference finals. Toronto has been there before. I believe in those three teams before I believe in the Rockets, the Thunder. I mean, come on. The Timberwolves should be better than what they are, but they're not. The East is just from top to bottom, not that much weaker than the West. The West has like the king, but it feels like the East is full of a bunch of knights who are just better than what's in the West. I mean, the West is, it's just not that good this year. And I want to get this argument to the players that are in the East. There are great players in the Eastern Conference. You have Kyrie. You have Kawhi Leonard. You have Victor Oladipo. You have Giannis Antetokounmpo. You have a bunch of really good players in the East. You have Kemba Walker, who's on a very bad team, but he is a legit superstar level talent. So this idea that all of the talent along with the teams is in the West is another thing I have a strong argument against. Jonas Valanciunas, who's on the Toronto Raptors, might be the second best center in the entire game of basketball. He's the most consistent center in the game of basketball. You have the Wizards with Wall and Beal. You have a bunch of teams, even the bad ones have some really good talent. Again, the Pacers not only have Oladipo, but they have Miles Turner. They have Sabonis, who's a real good role player type guy. You have these teams. Indiana added Tyreek Evans. These teams are legit. They have stars. In the West, yes, you have Curry. You have everybody on the Warriors. You have James Harden. You have Chris Paul. But then after that, there's a bunch of superstars who are underachievers. The East even has Blake Griffin playing out of his mind this year at times. The West isn't this place with all these stars. You have LeBron, I get it. LeBron really changed the powerhouse, so most of the really top 10 players are in the West. But the East is not lacking in talent. It's not lacking in teams. What is it really lacking in here, people? Because the Warriors have won all these titles. But let's be serious. If the Warriors weren't around the last 4 years, LeBron might have 4 titles. He could have beaten those Rockets teams. He could have beaten those other teams that were in the West. He would have beaten those Oklahoma City Thunder teams. I mean, these teams are just not they're not as powerful as we all think they are. Heck, let's even talk about the coaches that are in the East compared to the West. You have Brad Stevens. You have Nick Nurse, he's a rookie, but he looks pretty good. You have Mike Budenholzer, who's turning around the Milwaukee Bucks. You have Nate McMillan, who has turned around the Pacers. There might be overall better coaching than there is in the West. The West is full of a bunch of these guys who have had success who are no longer having it. The West, it just feels like Greg Popovich isn't at the top of his game right now. He's not the same guy. The Spurs are not the same team. These teams that we just think, we look at the West and we go, yeah, all the talent goes West. I remember this when Amari Stoudemire went East, and it was like, oh, the one guy, the one superstar finally goes East. It's not like that way anymore, folks. There is equal talent in the East than there is in the West. And I just feel like this year is a real year where it seems like the East might be the better conference. And I think overall this year, the East is the better conference. If there was no Warriors, the NBA title winner would be in the East. I think that is an overall fact, that I believe in Boston, Philly, Milwaukee, and Toronto more than I believe in the Houston Rockets, or the Oklahoma City Thunder or the Denver Nuggets or the LA Clippers or any of those teams. The East would win the title if it weren't for the Golden State Warriors. Of course, the Warriors have a fifth All-Star looming on the bench there in DeMarcus Cousins, and when he enters the frame, this conversation won't really even matter because the NBA title is going to go to another Western Conference team. But I am sick and tired of hearing about, oh my God, the Western Conference is so much better than the East, because it's not, and it hasn't been that way in a while. Again, last year there were two great teams in the West. Last year you had two great teams in the West, Golden State and Houston. In the East last year you had Cleveland, you had Boston, you had Toronto. Again, you have that. But this year you have the additions of teams like Milwaukee and Indiana who have become legitimate. Indiana became legitimate when they went 7 games with Cleveland. Again, the East just has more legitimate from top to bottom. The bottom of the West is just mediocre, and they're underachievers. Minnesota is never going to prove it. Again, a team that I am so frustrated with people talking about how good they are is the Portland Trailblazers. Portland Trailblazers last year were the 3 seed, and they lost to the 6 seed Pelicans, and they let Rajon Rondo dominate the series. I no longer have belief in the Portland Trailblazers at all. I don't believe in Dame Lillard as the best player on a team, and I don't believe in CJ McCollum on the team. The West is full of a bunch of teams that win a lot in the regular season because the rest of the West isn't as good as they beat up on each other. The East is full of these teams who I believe can win playoff series. I don't believe Portland's going to win a playoff series. I do believe that Denver could win a playoff series. Again, the Western Conference Finals is up for grabs, and so's the East. But I believe that the East will have 2 legit contenders in the Western Conference Finals. It might be Golden State and somebody who's not even close to as good as Golden State. The East has potential for teams to win the NBA Finals. There's a potential that Boston, Toronto, or Philly could win the NBA Finals. I would not be completely shocked if that were to happen. Again, my majority of the vote would go to the Golden State Warriors, but that is one team, and one team does not make a conference. I compare it to what's going on with college football with Alabama. Alabama is the clear number 1 best team in college football. But that does not mean the SEC is the greatest conference ever. The SEC is that because every team that's won the title and such has won the conference. And that must tick off the other conferences. But I get it. The Warriors are dominating, so we're going to say that the West is great. Alabama is dominating, so we're going to say the SEC is the best. That's how these things are going to go. But that doesn't mean that the other competition should be looked down upon. And I just feel like so many people are looking down upon the East because there are some bad teams. The Knicks are bad. The Magic are bad. There are bad teams. The Hornets are bad. There are some really bad teams at the bottom of the East. But the middle of the West, they're all the same teams. From Portland on down, they're all the same teams. The Clippers are the same as the Trailblazers. The only 3 teams that I think are different in the West that have the potential to be great are Golden State, of course, the Rockets, and the Oklahoma City Thunder because of Russell Westbrook and Paul George. Those are the 3 teams. In the East, you have some teams that are interesting that could do things. Blake Griffin, if he could ever figure it out fully in Detroit, there's something interesting there. There are teams at the near bottom of the East. Miami was a playoff team last year. If they could ever get it around and get a full season of Hassan Whiteside, I just think there are more teams in the East that I can believe in. I believe in the Pacers. I believe in the Celtics. I believe in the Raptors. I believe in Philadelphia. And I believe in Milwaukee because they not only have great players, they have great coaches. They are legit contenders in my eyes. They could be second-round teams that could really make a run at it. In the West, they just seem like they're there year in and year out. But they're never a threat. There's never a moment in a season where I believe, wow, Portland is really dangerous. There's never that moment. Last year, there was only that moment with 2 teams. 2 teams, Golden State and Houston. And again, 2 teams does not make a conference. And this year, it's down to 1. I do believe that the Houston Rockets will correct themselves because they have too much talent with Harden, Paul, and Capella. Capella is just an underrated player overall. I don't want to get into that, but I do want to get into this idea that the West is just living off of this myth that all of the star players and all of the great teams are in the West. This is not the 2007 NBA where the West is going to have 8 50-game winners. This is going to be the West where there's one great team and then there are 7 others that are interchangeable and are massively, massively flawed and will not ever be thought of as a real contender in today's NBA. That is a fact. Other than the Golden State Warriors, the other 7 teams in the West that make the playoffs will not be looked at as contenders for the title unless they make a huge trade. Barring a huge trade, none of those teams will be thought of as real-life NBA contenders. The last thing I want to touch on is the young talent alone in the Eastern Conference. Let's talk about these names. Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Giannis Antetokounmpo, Victor Oladipo. All of these guys are so young. Kyrie Irving is still so young. Think about those names alone. All of the young talent seems to be coming out of the Eastern Conference. Joel Embiid is the best big man in the game. Jason Tatum looks like he could easily score 25 a night without any real maximum effort. Jaylen Brown can attack the basket at will. Each of these guys are on the rise. Yes, the West has Doncic, but it seems like the East is full of these guys who haven't even found themselves. Miles Turner looks like he can be an absolute star in this games at times. All of the young talent is in the East. So for years to come, it looks like we could really have a total Eastern Conference takeover. Because, I mean, listen, if the Knicks get Porzingis back next year, they could become a legit team. When it comes to the NBA, all the young stars seem to be in the East, and all the guys that we seem to know that are legit are in the West, but there are these guys who we don't even know their full potential. Jason Tatum might be a great defender. Jaylen Brown, if he learns to hit a jump shot, could become a star. And Ben Simmons, if he ever gets a jump shot, could become an MVP caliber type of player. But in the West, it seems like I've kind of given up on believing in Andrew Wiggins and Karl Anthony Towns. I do love their talents, but I don't really know where I stand with them right now. I'm not in full belief of their talents, but I believe in the guys that I just mentioned. Embiid, Simmons, Tatum, Brown, those guys. I mean, the sky's the limit for those players. It seems like they haven't reached their full massive star potential, and it seems like the West, Curry is great. I know what Curry is. Klay Thompson is great. I know what Klay Thompson is. The one guy with the Nuggets that I really believe could become a full-on superstar is Jokic. I don't think we've seen the best of Jokic yet. Nikola Jokic doesn't quite understand if he's a scorer or a passer yet, but he's going to evolve and transform his game. But again, on the Eastern Conference side, all the young stars are there. It seems like in the years to come, it's not just a now that I believe the Eastern Conference is better. It's that in the future, I believe they are going to become the dominant conference. And I'm not just saying that as a Boston Celtics fan. I'm saying that I get to see a bunch of these guys night in and night out, and there are young, shining stars who can put on a show, not only scoring, defensive. Hey, Trae Young might even develop into be a nice little player for the Hawks. We don't know, but it seems like all the young star potential is Jason Tatum and Ben Simmons are legit going to be MVP caliber players. Joel Embiid is already an MVP caliber player. And by the way, Kyrie Irving is only 26 years of age. The sky is the limit. And Jaylen Brown, again, if Jaylen Brown ever develops a jump shot, he will become a force of nature in today's NBA. The East has the young talent. The West has the established talent. The West does have some guys, but I don't think they have the same amount of guys. Lonzo Ball, don't really know where I'm at with him either. But Brandon Ingram, I believe in Brandon Ingram, and I think the Lakers might be giving up on Brandon Ingram, which would be a huge, huge mistake. But the Eastern Conference and its young talent should not be ignored. And at once and for all, I am sick and tired of the Western Conference being proclaimed as this great, great conference with no bad teams. FYI, the Phoenix Suns are in the Western Conference, and they are the worst team in basketball. And again, 2 through 7 in the West that make the playoffs will not be thought of as playoff contenders. They are all, in my estimation, playoff pretenders. The Eastern Conference, for all my money, for what it's worth, the Eastern Conference this year is the overall better conference. And that will be played out into the regular season and into the postseason, because you will have moments where you believe Jimmy Butler and the Sixers are real contenders. You will have moments, we've already had moments, where you thought Giannis Antetokounmpo and the Bucks are real contenders. You will have moments where you believe in the Celtics again. And you will have moments where you believe in the Raptors. You will have 0 moments like that with 2 through 7 in the West. It's just not going to happen because those teams are not legitimate contenders in the NBA like the top of the East is. And again, there are teams like the Wizards, and there are a team like the Wizards that might figure it out at the right time. The East is not only the conference to beat now, but it will be the conference to beat moving forward. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Head to Head Podcast. I'm Cam McKinney. There will be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. So please rate, review, subscribe, and listen. Thanks again.